Tonight, we welcome Katherine Stewart, who is the author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, the award-winning book upon which the documentary feature, God and Country, produced by Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, is based. She has covered the intersection of faith and politics for over 15 years. Her work appears in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, the Guardian, and Religion News Service, and she has been featured on broadcast media outlets such as MSNBC, CNN, and NPR. Her 2012 book, The Good News Club, covered the religious right's effort to infiltrate and undermine public education. Tonight, she'll be speaking with us about her new book, Money, Lies, and God, which was actually reviewed in the New York Times today. How timely is that? She will be joined in conversation by Anthea Butler, who is the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor in American Social Thought and Chair of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. A historian of African American and American religion, Professor Butler's research and writing spans African American religion and American religious history, race, politics, evangelicalism, media, and popular culture. Butler's recent book is White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, on Ferris and Ferris/UNC Press. Professor Butler is also a contributor to the 1619 book, A New Beginning, with a chapter entitled Church. Her first book is Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World, also published by UNC Press. We are clearly in for a fascinating conversation tonight. Please join me in welcoming Katherine Stewart and Anthea Butler.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight, braving this really, really miserable cold. We all get credit for leaving the house. Thank you so much. Before we get started, I'd like to read a short selection from my new book, Money, Lies, and God. I'm going to read a selection from the introduction, just about 3 to 5 minutes. Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said that the United States is dedicated to a proposition. The American idea, as he saw it, is the familiar one articulated in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. It says that all people are created equal, that a free people in a pluralistic society may govern themselves, that they do so through laws deliberated in public, grounded in appeals to reason, and applied equally to all, and that they established these laws through democratic representation in government. In the centuries after 1776, in its better moments, the United States exported this revolutionary idea and inspired people around the world to embrace their freedom. But in recent years, a political movement has emerged that fundamentally does not believe in the American idea. It claims that America is dedicated not to a proposition, but to a particular religion and culture. It asserts that an insidious and alien elite has betrayed and abandoned the nation's sacred heritage. It proposes to redeem America, and it acts on the extreme conviction that any means are justified in such a momentous project. It takes for granted that certain kinds of Americans have a right to rule, and that the rest have a duty to obey. No longer casting the United States as a beacon of freedom, it exports this counter-revolutionary creed through alliances with leaders and activists who are themselves hostile to democracy. This movement has captured one of the nation's 2 major political parties, and some of its leading thinkers explicitly model their ambitions on corrupt and illiberal regimes abroad that render education, the media, and the corporate sector subservient to one-party authoritarian state. How did such an anti-democratic movement take root in America? That is the question I aim to answer in this book. As a reporter, I like to look first and theorize later. I'm interested in facts, not polemics, though I won't stand in the way of facts when they lead to pointed conclusions. This book is therefore a collection of dispatches from the front lines of the current assault on American democracy. My goal has been to record what I've seen and heard from leaders and supporters of the anti-democratic movement in the auditoriums and breakout rooms at national conferences, around the table at informal gatherings of activists, in the living rooms of the rank and file, and in the pews of hardline churches. The story features a rowdy mix of personalities: apostles of Jesus, atheistic billionaires, reactionary Catholic theologians, pseudo-Platonic intellectuals, woman-hating opponents of the gynocracy, they really call it that, high-powered evangelical networkers, Jewish devotees of Ayn Rand, pronatalists occupied with a dearth of white babies, COVID truthers, and battalions of spirit warriors who appear to be inventing a new style of religion, even as they set about undermining democracy at its foundations. I don't pretend to cover all the angles. I don't pretend to cover all the angles. Others have found new and important ways to report on the subject. That's why we have Professor Butler here with us today. And I reference or cite the work of as many as I can throughout the book in the hopes that it will inspire further study. Even so, I think I've scattered enough of the territory to say something about the origins and nature of the anti-democratic movement in America. In this preface, the last of the pages to be written for this book, I will offer a handful of principal findings. Well, let me begin by repeating the obvious. This movement represents a serious threat to the survival of American democracy. Even at this late date, I continue to hear feel-good suggestions that the political conflicts of the moment are the result of incivility, tribalism, effective partisanship, or some other unfortunate trend in manners that affects every side of the political debates equally. All will be well, the thinking goes, if the red people and the blue people would just sit down for some talk therapy and give a little to the other side. In earlier times, this may have been sage advice. Today, it is a delusion. American democracy is failing because it is under direct attack. It is not coming equally from both sides. The movement described in this book isn't looking for a seat at the noisy table of American democracy. It wants to burn down the house. It isn't the product of misunderstandings. It advances its anti-democratic agenda by actively promoting disinformation and conspiracism. In the pages that follow, I will bring the receipts to support these uncomfortable facts. For now, I will venture that few who have familiarized themselves with this movement will be tempted to minimize the danger it represents to our collective well-being. Well, thank you so much for listening, and I think I'm going to engage in conversation with Professor Butler.
Thanks, Katherine. I should warn you now that Katherine and I are friends, and if we fall into a ditch and start talking about a lot of stuff, just wave at us so that you won't, this won't go off the deep end, because we both have a lot to say. But, I was listening to you reading, and I thought one of the things that might be interesting for people to hear is, how did you get into this in the first place? Because it takes a little something to go hang out with these folks. And I want you to tell your story, because I think it's always important when you talk to a journalist and a writer to know why did you come to this thing, and why have you been on this thing for the last 2 books?
Yeah. Well, I first, 16 years ago, I was on a sunny playground in Santa Barbara, California, and I learned that a Good News Club was coming to my daughter's public elementary school. Good News Clubs are after-school programs of fundamentalist religious indoctrination. They target children in their public schools, elementary-age kids who are too young to read, and they tell them that they're going to go to hell if they don't believe in Jesus, and they need to attend the right kind of church, and they deceive little kids, basically, into thinking that their public school endorses this form of the faith, and then they use that sort of misinformation to get kids to, engage in what I could really only describe as faith-based bullying and bigotry. They tell, kids, go out there and tell your friends, go to hell without Jesus, you need to join our club. And they give kids candy or prizes for recruiting their peers to the club. And I was really astonished to learn that these clubs were legal and constitutional, given the principle of church-state separation. And I couldn't, making a long story short, I was really kind of shocked by the fact that they were allowed to be in the public schools. I realized that there were a couple thousand of these clubs operating in public schools nationwide, and that they were being coordinated by a national organization. So what looked like a local initiative driven by local personalities was in fact a national initiative from by an organization that was very deeply networked with a whole lot of other organizations. I started researching the legal strategy that had allowed these groups to be placed in public schools in the first place. And I recognized that they had achieved a Supreme Court win that was a consequence of 15 years or 16 years of very careful mapping out, bringing the right cases to the right courts, finding just the right plaintiffs to create these novel legal building blocks that would build up to this big win, which they got in 2001. It's called Good News Club versus Milford Central School. I won't get into the weeds with that, but I could see that the more I learned about this initiative, the more I learned about their legal strategy, the more I learned about their alliances, the more I recognized that they were really hostile to the institution of public education. And this, I began to learn about that sort of hostility, the roots of hostility to public ed. But I also recognized that the attack on public education was just one small part of a much larger attack on America as a modern constitutional democracy, an attack on our foundational principles. And so in 2012, I published my first book in this area, The Good News Club, about the war on public education. I kept, my work has always followed my research. Over the years, I kept writing and researching, and my last book, The Power Worshippers, was really a focus on religious nationalism or Christian nationalism in the U.S., and Money, Lies, and God takes that piece of it and adds research about other aspects of the anti-democratic movement.
Thank you. I was thinking about this because, we didn't meet on the first book. We met on the second book, right, Power Worshippers. And I was thinking about this, and you kind of caught the wave of what was happening with Christian nationalism before we even started calling it that, because that wasn't a term that everybody was using. And then now with Money, Lies, and God, it's a term that it's everywhere, right? And so I thought, it would be interesting for you to talk about what you see as different about the way that Christian nationalism was operating then versus now, and maybe sort of explain that for people. Because I think for, the average everyday person, you think, oh, Christian nationalism, Christians love America. That must be a good thing. Explain.
Yeah, wow, there's so much to say here. First, I think we need to acknowledge Michelle Goldberg's book, Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism. That came out in 2006 or 2007. It's an incredible book, one of the first books I read in this field. So there were researchers and writers who were sort of working in this area for a lot longer than I was. I think about Sarah Posner, who's written some spectacular books. I think about, Peter Montgomery, all the people at Right Wing Watch. I mean, there are just so many folks, the people at PRA. There are different researchers working in this field. But I think in an earlier time, the religious right liked to, even though the radicalism was there, it was always there, sort of as an undercurrent. But when religious right leaders would present themselves to the general public, or even in some of their big gatherings, national conferences, they just kind of would portray themselves as people who want a seat at the table in the noisy forum of American democracy. This is really about values. This is about these culture war issues. But it's never just been about the culture war issues. This has always been, this is a movement that's been anti-democratic to its core. I could see that when I first started researching the movement. I was trained as an investigative journalist by the late Wayne Barrett. He was an extraordinary mentor. He was, at the time I was working for him, he was researching New York City scandals, financial scandals, real estate scandals. He was also writing the first biography of Donald Trump, which is really still a book that a lot of people use as a reference. And he taught me follow the money, listen. Listening is underrated. He also taught me that if you really want to know what's happening, go into the room where it's happening. So I thought, okay, these people think they have a right to come to my kids' public school. I have a right to go to their national convention. And when I walked into their national convention, the radicalism was astonishing. They couldn't say enough terrible things about public schools. The institutions that they were actually exploiting to install their clubs, at often for free or extremely low cost. They called our children the harvest. They called our public schools their mission fields. They would say, knock down all doors, or sometimes they'd say, we want to kick in the doors to the public schools. And so I just feel like when you go to the places, it was like a trial, an introduction by fire. I was just astonished by the radicalism from the start. But then you start looking at the historical sources that they're drawing from. You look into the theology, you look at Christian Reconstructionism, you look at leaders of the Southern Presbyterian Church and the kind of ideas that have drawn from one century to the next, these ideas that really don't believe in equality, a kind of reactionary nationalism, idea of who gets to properly belong in the country, who gets to count as equal, and who doesn't. And you recognize it's sort of illiberalism. It's been in America from the start, but that's not to say that there haven't been wonderful moves toward coinciding toward greater justice at the same time. But that strain has always been there. We're just seeing it play out now in a bigger way than we have in a really long time.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, one of the things that you and I both have been to some of these meetings, right? But there's a change that I think is really important. And so when you go to the meetings, we kind of talked about this. I will not give away her cover, by the way. You go to the meetings, you go as a person, you go, you do your thing, right? I used to be able to go to the meetings. Why can't I go to the meetings right now, folks? Look at me. I used to go, I went back when Sarah Palin was thinking about running for president. I went to lots of Palin things. I did all of this stuff. But when Donald Trump came, I couldn't go because there was a focus on who I was in my body as a Black woman. And so race also has a lot to do with this. And I think, for a lot of people, the question that I keep getting asked all the time, and I know I didn't ask you this question before, but I'm going to spring it now. One of the things I think is very interesting is that people look at this movement and they think, oh, well, look, it's racially mixed. This is not something bad. Now, I want to talk about what you think is underlying all of this, because I have a theory, and I'm willing to say it here in a minute. But I want to
hear your theory.
Yeah, well,
let's hear your theory.
Well, I think one of the things about this is that this Christian nationalism attracts people because of whiteness and what whiteness will do for you and how that plans out. And I know for some people in here, you're going, what do you mean? I mean this. Christian is assumed to be white. And if you are a Christian, you get moved into a different kind of category. And that category is a category of privilege because you believe in the same kind of Christian things. And so when you see people who are at, like, for instance, I'll get this example because it happened here in Philadelphia, Moms for Liberty, for example. And they were here, and the leader of Moms for Liberty here in Philadelphia is an African-American woman. And people would be surprised by that, but I say you shouldn't be surprised by that because everybody has aspirations. And the aspirational part of this is about whiteness. And it's about an Americanness that gets defined by whiteness and not by the pluralistic thing that you always knew in school that was about, immigration, and that was great, and people came from all these different countries in Europe in the 19th century, and we're a great melting pot. It's not about a melting pot anymore. It's about homogeneity, and the homogeneity is about Christianity with a layer of whiteness underneath it. That's really important.
It's really interesting, and I would say that, in some sectors of the Christian nationalist movement, people of color have enormous strategic value for the movement because they have, the movement has been, has a sort of draws on a history of racism. It draws on a history of theologians who called segregation scriptural, for instance, and things like that. But there's also, the movement is drawing new energy from, I would say, a sector of like neo-charismatic movements and a sector of Pentecostal movements, which are themselves like very diverse, like broadly politically diverse, but a sector of those movements is very easily given over to sort of hard right politics. They see conflicts in, battles in the spiritual realm playing out in the politics here and now. And those movements are often multiracial and also transnational. Mm-hmm. And movement leaders, I think about people like Ralph Reed, who's been in the strategist for years and is very astute. He recognized that the movement will not survive if it is limited to older white evangelicals. Yeah. So in recent years, these strategists have made an enormous effort to reach out to communities of color, but in particular Latino, communities that are sort of more conservative leaning, often within this neo-charismatic world. And I try every year to go to Ralph Reed's Road to Majority conference, and there are a lot of folks there who are Latino and part of these Pentecostal or neo-charismatic churches. And they're recruited. They draw the pastors into networks. I think the pastor networks are a really underappreciated sector, feature of this movement. They're very like Watchmen on the Wall. You've got Faith Wins, and you've got special networks, particularly focused on different populations. If they draw the pastors into networks, they give them really sophisticated tools for turning out their congregations to vote on their so-called biblical values, which is never about, caring for the least of these and, loving your neighbor. It's always about, abortion, same-sex marriage, and things like that. And then, and we've seen the consequence at the ballot box. So between 2016 and 2020, the Latino vote overall shifted 8 to 10 points in favor of Trump, and it shifted even more between 20 and 24. And it's very interesting. This is movement outreach. It's not necessarily GOP outreach.
Yeah, exactly. Because GOP kind of just dropped it.
Yeah.
They weren't even thinking about it. They had that whole thing that they tied up and then nothing happened. But this is the pastor outreach. This is the religious outreach. So it's when you see Trump, this last election cycle, going to all these different places, like the religious broadcasters and all of that. That was specific kind of outreach. I was actually in North Carolina in October, and I spoke at a church, and the church was like, what do you mean Trump is coming in 2 weeks? I'm like, didn't you know? He's having a big pastors meeting here. They're like, no, we didn't know. And I think this is the thing that flies underneath the radar screen for people, where they don't see this kind of organizing in terms of stuff. And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about what this web looks like. And this is a really intricate web of people, right? And I think one of the things that your book really is helpful for is to start to understand this interconnectedness between different kinds of groups.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the web, I don't know where to start here. I'll say that Christian nationalism is not just an ideology. It's a mindset, but it's also a machine. And I want to talk about the machinery. It's like the strength of that movement is in its deep organizational infrastructure. It's leadership-driven and it's organization-driven. And the organizations can be divided into categories. You have right-wing policy groups, you have think tanks, you have a vast right-wing legal ecosphere, right? You have very sophisticated data initiatives, you have pastor networks, you have a far-right, I would say, messaging or disinformation sphere as well. And networking organizations that give different features of the leadership on the same page. And this is the reason the movement is as strong as it is. If one of the leaders sort of falls out, well, there's others to take their place. I mean, we saw that, who was it, Jerry Falwell Jr., you know, he blew up, but, you know, there's others sort of, and Charlie Kirk's doing fine. I mean, he's doing better than ever.
Doing very fine.
He's doing better than ever. I just went to America Fest, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh,
tell them about
that
this.
That was wild.
I think this is really interesting.
20,000 hardcore MAGA supporters in Phoenix, Arizona, at the convention center. It's Charlie Kirk's organization. Lots of young kids. I mean, Charlie Kirk is doing really clever outreach to young people. He also played a pretty important role in the get out the vote in the 2024 election. Here's one of the things that struck me the most, a couple things. I'll tell you. One thing that struck me is there's a guy named Lucas Miles. He's the head of Turning Point USA Faith. It's their faith outreach arm. He's written a book titled Woke Jesus, and then the subtitle is something like, you know, the heresy destroying the American church or something like that. I don't have the title in front of me. But his whole thing is like, you know, he said it's his mission to eradicate wokeism from the American pulpit. What is wokeism? Well, he said specifically the social gospel. It's heretical, progressive Christianity. He even took aim at that "he gets us" ad. Yeah. You know that
like
he gets
that at
us?
all. Yeah. Yeah, no, I know.
I mean,
You've seen this ad. It's all been on the football games and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
I mean, it's amazing. He's like, and so he said, the sin of progressivism started to enter the American church in the 1700s. What is he talking about?
He does not know. Most of the time they make up history. This is the other thing that drives me crazy.
I know.
Yeah.
Take it back to the 1700s. He said, he said he's working with 3,500 pastors to form a new Nicene Creed and Council. That was interesting.
Nicene Creed, okay. Like 325. What are you talking about? Yeah, but this is the thing I think is really important about Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk got funded, and this is a part that I think is really interesting about your book, is you talk about money. And Charlie Kirk got funded by a big billionaire, right, who's dead now. And look who's running everything, Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk started off as somebody who was chasing after people. Turning Point was chasing after professors. I know because I was one of the people on their, professor watch list. This is how he got started. And then he moved on to bigger and better things. But I think the Turning Point faith thing has been very important, because what were they doing every Saturday during 2022 and 2024? Running weekend things in Arizona that were basically like between revivals and political meetings. And so they got people to vote. And so I think this is really important. This flies underneath everybody's radar screen. Nobody watches this stuff because it didn't get reported. Nobody's looking at it. But people like you, Kathleen, are out there, trying to get this information. And I think people need to understand how important that is.
Yeah, I don't think you can understand what's happening in American politics today without understanding this movement, its modes of operation. And there's a couple other features of the movement I'd like to talk about briefly. And I want to talk about the title of my book, Money, Lies, and God. So first, money, because I pay enormous attention to a group that I call the funders. These are the people who are the beneficiaries of massive concentrations of wealth at the tippy top of the economic spectrum over the past decades, and frankly, I'm thinking about people like Barry Seid or the Corkerys or the folks behind the Bradley Foundation or Sky Foundation, Sean Filer. We can think about Musk or Peter Thiel. I mean, religiously, these people are frankly all over the place, but they're investing their fortunes, or at least a portion of their fortunes, in the destruction of our democracy. And part of the way they're doing that is funding these disinformation operations that are separating a large sector of the American public from the facts. And the problem, that's just creating a lot of challenges. I mean, that's kind of where lies comes in to the title of the book. In the book, I feature a number of different kinds of different disinformation operations. One of them that I'll tell you about very briefly is called Reawaken America. It's a kind of traveling pro-Trump conspiracy fest that sets up in mega churches around the country. And you walk in there and every single conspiracy you ever heard is being promoted. The big lie of the stolen election, the great replacement, they're trying to microchip you with the vaccine. I mean, every nutty conspiracy, JFK is still alive, but the hostility, the sort of, the fear and hostility, I mean, a lot of this is really about separating people from the facts, making them afraid, and making them manipulable. So that's quite dangerous. And then a God, for the title is, because a large part of the movement is focused on, I would say, the largest most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is Christian nationalism. But I also shine a bright light on a group I call the thinkers. These are folks many of which are affiliated with the movement called the New Right. Some of them, like Russell Vogt, who is now Trump's Director of Office of Management and Budget, identifies Christian nationalists, or at least seem very Christian nationalism friendly. Others, frankly, are quite atheistic. They seem really just interested in power. Some of them a large number of them derive inspiration actually from a political theorist associated with the Nazis, Carl Schmitt, a Nazi political theorist. And I really get into the ways that his ideas have sort of infused the New Right. He's one of the, several thinkers whose ideas have kind of worked their way in there. But this cohort also plays an extraordinarily important role in the anti-democratic movement broadly. Some of them function as I would call them like funder whisperers. They tell the really rich people how to spend their money, what features of the infrastructure to put their money into.
Yeah, and I think, the name that always pops up for everybody is Leonard Leo, right? We can't leave him out, because I think that's really important. It's like when you start buying things and making sure that people can get on the court, then you've got a wrap. And I think if we had been thinking about all of this money for a long time, I used to tell people, I'm thinking about Focus on the Family and all these other organizations, but there are these deep organizations that you have researched, like Claremont, that are really important to how these movements move. And so one of the things I was thinking about asking you is, you use a term in your book that I think is really important to hear people define, and it's called reactionary nihilism. And I thought this is a good way to talk about what has happened. And so can you tell everybody what that's about and why you think that this is central to the core to bring all these people together?
Yeah, I think of nihilism as the idea that there is no inherent value in the world, that people, by their actions rather than by any declaration, believe that there's no inherent value in the world, that don't believe that truth is important, that believe that truth is just another weapon to use in service of politics and the war of politics. They see politics as war, not as problem solving. And reactionary, I think of as people who want to bring back elements of a regressive social order. They have a fantasy about what would make the world better, but it's just a fantasy. It's like a fantasy of an imagined past that includes these elements of a regressive social order, bringing back gender hierarchy, racial hierarchy, sort of regressive economic arrangements, and the like. And I put those two words together to kind of describe what this movement is after. They're, again, not aiming for a seat at the table of American democracy. They believe, they claim that our country is under such enormous threat because of the threat of the woke, whatever the hell that means. I mean, they basically using this term, they're throwing every single thing in the bucket that they don't like and calling it woke. And they're using that, this idea that we're facing this permanent emergency because of equality, because of pluralism, because of progress and the values of liberalism. They think that this represents an emergency, or at least they say they think that. And they're using this as an excuse to smash it. They've been telling us for a long time what they want to do. They've said they want to smash the institutions of democracy. They want to smash the administrative state. I want to point something out. I think that Americans have been subject for some time from the right to propaganda that says government is always terrible, it never does anything good. Well, I think we need to be reminded of the bad things that happen when there is no effective government, when government is led by kleptocrats and people who just want to enrich themselves at the public expense, we see examples of this all over the world. Really dysfunctional societies, and frankly, we're seeing moves in this, pretty bold moves in this direction. I think we're preparing to see, I would say, like heroic levels of corruption in our government. We're already seeing it. So yeah.
I will bring this up because I'm terrible because I watch too much news. But, I think one of the things that this week was just so asinine to me was, Trump saying everybody has to come back to work because, they're all going to be out on the golf course. And where was he going this week? To the golf course, right? And so, that's like a little small thing. If that was the only thing that was happening, that'd be okay. But there's so much more happening. And this kind of kleptocracy and how everybody's going to make money is something now. You're trading on something else. And so what is fascinating to me is that, I do history. And so I look at this history of religious people as specifically evangelicals, which is a much broader swath now. And, they used to be like, oh, we want to save the world. We want to do this. And like, Jesus ain't coming back. They're trying to line their pockets. And not only are they trying to line the pockets, it's a thing about power. And they've always said, I think the biggest canard that happened in America was that everybody believed evangelicals when they said, we just want Jesus to come back and we want to save the world. They want to make the world theirs. And not only do they want to make the world theirs, they want to make everybody else kowtow to the way that they want the world to be. And so I think one of the things that I'm really curious about is that have different sections in the book. The gender question is also a big question in the midst of this. And I feel like one of the things that I would ask if I wasn't doing the work that I did is like, how are women in this?
Yeah, there's, the women in the movement, some of them are simply aligning themselves with power. This is just something human beings do, right? For some women in the movement, we're talking about like a huge number of people. Many women in the movement have been persuaded that abortion is the greatest moral evil of our time, and that is until they need them. Because if you look at the statistics of who gets abortions, it's often very religious women who are conservative who, frankly, need them, just as other groups do at different times. But so anti-abortion politics becomes like a kind of Rubicon they have to pass through in order to have a seat at the table in this movement. Others are sort of like Phyllis Schlafly. She had a really fabulous quote. I wish I had it with me here. She said something along the lines of like, because women bear the consequences of the sex act, men must be compelled or forced to care for the women and the children. And so it's this idea that the only way for women to claw back any dignity in a deeply unequal world is to leave women no choices, men no choices, and make sex have consequences. Babies are the consequences, natural consequences of sex in any context, which is deeply cynical.
Yeah, it's
deeply cynical, and it also doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't work. But it's also about, sexual politics, too. You could have said money, lies, God, and sex, right?
No, I know. I was trying to get sex lies, and videotape.
Yeah, I was thinking about that a movie.
I know.
No, you could have really put sex in here, too, because I think the other part of this is it's not just about a gender question, it's about a sexuality question, because, I always mark the moment where the fight really got really ramped up was Obergefell, when same-sex marriage came in. And that was the moment in which the right was just like, listen, we got to win something. And that, the next year we had Trump, we had all this stuff, right? And so it's very interesting to me, the kinds of things now that we're seeing. This is my observation. There's things that were on TV in the 80s and 90s in this country that I don't think we could show right now, because of how that's changed. And I think that's a really interesting place. And so I would like you to just talk a little bit about, the politics of sexuality with these folks and how they're wielding it in a different kind of way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Have you guys been hearing like this make men men again thing?
Yeah.
I literally saw a guy wearing a t-shirt that said make men men again at a gathering at Reawaken America. And you're hearing a lot of talk about manhood these days. And it's a way of bringing men into the movement, and it's really working. It's interesting. I think that sort of gender order is a kind of rocket fuel of this movement, as it is for a lot of authoritarian movements. In some instances, the idea, the draw for men is that you need to submit to the authorities. I mean, think about in an authoritarian society that also imposes like a strict gender order. There are so many out there, I'm not going to name any particular one, but the men have to submit. They don't have freedom of speech. They don't have any right to political opposition. Their daily life may be very constrained. They may be living in a sort of subordinate state, but yet, if there is that gender order, he can feel that he is better than the woman, his wife. I have a friend from a country where there's a very strict gender order, and she said, my dad, is very restricted in how he could live, but he didn't notice. He and the men around him didn't notice because they were too busy controlling their wives and their children and feeling sort of puffed up about that. So I also think that, authoritarian movements, they don't like equality. They thrive on division. They pursue policies intended to divide people and create conflict among the populations because that weakens the population's ability to sort of come together and get rid of a corrupt and abusive leader.
That's true. Well, we're going to move into the question phase. I have one more question for her, but I'm going to leave it to the last piece. So we've got somebody in the back with a microphone. If you raise your hand, I will call on you. We can get right up here in the front. Can you stand up where you had your hand up? If you stand up and, that way we can hear you and see you better for your question. And here's my admonition because I'm a professor. If you have a statement, we'll take it afterwards. But if you have a question, we'll allow it now.
Yeah, this is a question.
Thank you.
I wonder if there is a research correlation between attending like this religious thing in elementary school and day-to-day life for kids. Does it affect in some way?
Thank you for the question. I guess it's, is there a correlation between religious nationalism and children's daily lives? Is that the question?
Oh, if you attend a club in school, does that make you more likely to be a Christian nationalist? Is that what you're asking?
Does it change something compared to without that?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I mean, I think what he's trying to ask is basically, does it change something from the people who were going to the good news clubs and now they're adults? Are they more
right.
susceptible to doing this or not, I think?
Well, what's really interesting to me, a couple things. First of all, the movement is very focused on kids. They call them sometimes the 4-14 window. That is the ages between 4 and 14 when people's religious identities are formed. And in fact, there's a book called The 4-14 Window written by Louis Bush. He's one of the movement's key mission strategists. Has anybody heard of, I think, it's called the 1040 window? It's the part of the globe between 10 and 40 north longitude where the most, they call them unreached people groups live. So he came up with this idea of the 1040 window, and then thousands of missionaries were dispatched to this area across the globe to reach those who had not been exposed to the gospel. And then a few years later, he came up with a book called The 4-14 Window, which is we need to reach children between the ages of 4 and 14. He wrote a book about this, and the introduction to the book, the fellow who wrote the introduction said, again, I wish I'd had it with me, he said, Nazis focused on the youth, even the Taliban focuses on the youth. And he says this as an encouragement to go after these kids, and he said, may God join you in his battle for the little ones. And when I was researching that first book, I really was paying attention to, that group was called Strategic Machinery. Matt Staver, president and founder of, with his wife, of Liberty Council, which is one of the movement's key legal advocacy groups. He said, if you want to change the direction of the culture, the cruise ship, you got to focus on those kids. He said it's the most strategic age group that we have. And so I think there is that. But one thing that's, sorry, this is a bit of a long answer. One thing that's very interesting is I hear from ex-Good News Club people all the time. And they're like, I was raised in fundamentalism, I bear its scars. There's a whole like very interesting ex-evangelical movement. So just because they get you young doesn't mean they're going to keep you.
There's one back here right in the back. Raise your hand up high so people can see. They want to bring you a mic.
Thank you for your talk. So I guess I'm thinking about, the past authoritarian fascistic movements were very unified, right? And something you're both speaking to today is this kind of heterogeneous aspect of today's authoritarian fascistic movements. I was hoping you could speak a little bit more to that, how today's movements kind of coalesce, and then also what we can do, what mechanisms we could utilize to oppose that. Thank you.
That's a great question. I really want to thank you for that, because I think there's a real schism between the agenda of the funders and the agenda of the foot soldiers. So the funders want policies that are going to increase their wealth. They want the justification for their wealth. They say they just want deregulation, they just want capitalism and let capitalism do its thing. At the same time, they want protective policies for their monopolistic businesses. They want tax privileges, they want tax subsidies. I'm looking at you, Mr. Musk. They want privileged contracts. So they just want, they're incredibly wealthy and they just want to get wealthier, right? The rank and file are a very diverse and fractious group. Some of them, when they say cast their vote to end abortion, they're not really making arguing for major changes necessarily in the way our government is run. They kind of make a statement about their values. Others are kind of drawn in by this sort of rhetoric of, economic populism, which is a fake populism, worried about the price of eggs or the like. So they want a better deal for themselves and for the workforce, and many of them are seething in resentment at what they perceive as loss of privilege, racial privilege, but also socioeconomic privilege to some degree. And on that front, they're right about that. I mean, we've had this, huge concentration of wealth over the last couple of decades, or 5 decades really. The tippy top, life is getting harder for people in the bottom 90% of the economic spectrum. So I think there's a real opportunity when you're saying what can be done. I think there's a real opportunity as people lose their jobs, as people have to pay more for goods because of these needless trade wars, as people lose government services that they need or deserve, as frankly our government stops working because they've just slashed too many jobs, as our food becomes unsafe, as our environment becomes unsafe, as life is continually degraded because of the smashing that's happening in the administrative state, the abandonment of our dearest international allies, et cetera. Like, I think there's really an opportunity to say, those people are doing that to you, and here are the people who are fighting for you.
Yeah, and I would just say to the last part of your question about, what can you do? I think this is a moment for everybody to be thinking about, how do I get with my neighbors? How do I have my community? How do I think about, working on this on a micro level instead of just a macro level? Because the marches and everything are great, but we're about to enter into a time of, none of you, unless you're really old, can remember what the Depression was. My mother's 90 and she remembers because she behaves in some certain kinds of ways like that, right? But now we are facing something that is the destruction of the administrative state means the destruction of the safety net. And the safety net that everybody has counted on may not be there for you. And if you are getting the start of the safety net right now, it may disappear. What will you do? How do you get together with people? And I think we in this country have not watched other countries like Turkey or Hungary or others that have gone through this authoritarian thing, to see what do you do. I've said on one of the social media platforms yesterday, Jair Bolsonaro has been indicted. And somebody was like in my thing going, well, why, I said, I'm really jealous of Brazil because they're actually taking care of something. Trump was indicted. I'm like, no. We didn't get there. We didn't get what we were supposed to get, But we didn't get there. We put him back in office, and we're going to pay the price. Even if you didn't vote for him, you're going to pay the price. And how do you think about getting people together? You got to think about, what are you going to do now, instead of just thinking, you know, oh my God, I got to watch this every day. You got to start organizing now.
I also think that, thank you so much, that's really important. I also think that, you know, the problems we're facing are political, the solutions are political too. We really, thank you so much for bringing up the local, because I think it's really important to get involved in local activism. Sometimes, as you said, we get really, you know, focused on the national picture. We forget about what's happening in our town, what's happening in our local school boards, what's happening in town governance. And when we, you know, if we like leave that to the right, if we say, oh, someone else is going to handle that, you know, it's going to show up. The Moms for Liberty Brigade is going to show up, and they're the ones who are going to sort of take over. So it's really important to be locally engaged. And, you know, I think if one feels hopeless or sort of enervated, remember that that's part of the strategy. I mean, wasn't it Steve Bannon who said we want to flood the zone with, he used a word, I'm not sure I'm allowed to use it here.
The S word.
Yeah, the S word. He said, and that's intended to sort of make people frightened and give up. Well, don't let them do that to you. Now is the time for moral courage. When they lost the election in 2020, they didn't get into bed and say, oh, we lost an election. They vowed to fight. Now, they did a lot of bad things like spread lies and disinformation, but they also got out the vote. I mean, they really did. They went after low propensity voters. Here in Pennsylvania, they went after the Amish, and they got a lot of them. I mean, so it's really important, you know, to engage in the political process in meaningful ways. A local community activism is more important than ever. If you're a trusted voice in your community, you're going to be so much more persuasive than if you're reaching a community where you have no ties at all. And, you know, Ralph Reed said, pay no attention to our numbers. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day.
Exactly.
And he's right about that.
Yeah. I had a question up here in the front. Here and then here. Yeah, I'm going to take 1, 2, and then somebody else who was over here. We got 3. I think we'll be able to take these last 3.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. This is a really fascinating conversation. I'm sort of interested in the way this group of people is able to like find and weaponize divisions that did not previously exist. So I'm thinking of, for example, of Elise Stefanik holding a hearing where she's telling the president of Penn that the president of Penn is an anti-Semite, and getting so many people who would not normally be part of, you know well, this whole...
I probably shouldn't answer, but I'm going to answer.
like people who would be allies who are suddenly now like being successfully divided.
It's very interesting you use that example, and I'm going to tell you why. That thing, okay, there was a law firm that prepped all of them, and I should have been the person prepping them. Because basically, it's about doublespeak. And the way that she did that, you know, what happened in this whole thing with October 7th and everything else, by the time that they got to that panel, you know, the presidents were there thinking, we're here to answer serious questions. We're here to tell them that we're working on this on our campuses, and we don't want anti-Semitism, and we don't want this. And, you know, at the same time, we have free speech and everything. And so they came like presidents. They didn't come like politicians. And that's how she got them. You know, and now, you know, look, she's got a great position now in this administration. And I felt, you know, extremely sorry for our president, because our former president, because she got caught. And 2 out of the 3 they're not presidents anymore. And I think this is important because the use of language is crucial, and how they use language. And this is, you just answered the question. You just say, of course I'm against anti-Semitism. You don't try to give this answer that is a layered answer. They don't want a layered answer. This is a sledgehammer. It is not a fine-tooth tool. They're using a sledgehammer on you. If you don't understand the language that they use, then you're toast, because you can't fight that. And so they've got you everywhere. It's like how they took woke. Woke was something that happened right sort of towards, you know, I would say that was 2020, and that was, the people who had been, several African Americans murdered, and, culminating in that May of 2020, right? And so woke got used for a little while. They stole that word, but they also stole critical race theory. They went through all of these things, and Christopher Rufo was really great about that. He knew how to take a word and twist it, and then sort of started having woke conferences and everything else. This is what happened to them that day. And they didn't know it. It was like a freight train hit them. And the next thing you know, in 3-4 days, she is not the president of Penn anymore. And so this is, and I'm going to say this for the tape, and I'm going to look at the recorder while I'm saying it. This is where the universities are getting caught up, because they don't know what they are facing, because they have lived in this world that is the ivory tower. And they don't know how these people talk, and they don't know how to really, and so now what's happening? They're all trying to figure out how they're going to go from 62.5% to 15% for NIH. And they don't know that this has been planned for a long time, and they thought all the rest of us who were out here talking about this were absolutely nuts. Next question right here. It's sad, but I know, it is sad.
I also want to say thank you so much for being here. And Catherine, great to meet you in person finally. I recently spoke with a woman who is deconstructing, and I asked how she ended up getting involved in Christian nationalism. She said it was in high school. I was really shy. Great conversation, and she's doing great things now. But it led me to really start thinking about, I see it on the news every night, that we have a crisis of loneliness right now in this country. How are you seeing this play into people who normally would not look at Christian nationalism as a door to open, and are now going there?
I'm going to say something very different. You cannot discount what happened during COVID. COVID is crucial. I think, we were in our houses, we were by ourselves, we didn't get to see people, and a lot of people live alone. And so the connections that you found on the internet brought you into things. The algorithm brought you into something. And when you started looking at something on Facebook and you went down that rabbit hole, you started looking at this influencer that was on Instagram who talked about yoga, and then the next thing you know, you were talking about RFK and not getting vaccines. This led you there. It's not that people want to go into these things, it's what leads you there. Right? And so part of this, we haven't even talked about this, is a huge piece of all of this, is the algorithm and what social media has done to people. Because you see these things and you go right into, the kind of conspiracy theories of Q and all the rest of this stuff, and we didn't even get there, but that's not even something place we can go today. But I think that that's really important, and I'd like to hear what you want to say as the last thing, because we're out of time, and she has to go sign books for you.
No, I agree with you. It's really true. I mean, one thing the movement offers to people is a sense of community. And when you go into those spaces, there is this feeling of, solidarity and common purpose, in the sense of there's almost like a little bit of like a revolutionary frisson. We're breaking things, they're breaking democracy. But yes, this feeling that, wow, we're doing something revolutionary and exciting. So there is that kind of charge sometimes in those types of spaces. And what really makes me sad is that there's no equivalent movement on the other side of the political aisle, not in quite the same way. There are wonderful policy groups that do different great work. They often operate in silos. They're not as closely networked. I would say people on the sort of moderate liberal left are much more fractious, much less inclined to, submit to kind of hierarchy. Have a kind of, consistency of message, etc. But also, this is a movement that's not afraid to lie. It's always about the politics of outrage. They're always finding one crazy thing and then working that for the politics of outrage, or something that may not be terribly crazy, or lies. Like that. They're aborting babies after they're born. This doesn't exist. So, but they do this in order to create this sense of outrage, this sense of common, you're united by this idea of a common enemy, a common purpose, and that's just something that I've noted over time.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to end on, is that the thing that I think is most important is that you need to understand people are organized. They may not be the bulk of whoever thinks about any kind of thing in this country, but wherever you stand on the political spectrum, they are organized, and other people who are like-minded are not as organized. And I think organizing and paying attention to the people that you're around and getting involved in the community are the important things that you can do from this point forward to help us get through.
Please, a round of applause.